Hello everyone, today we meet again in microeconomic class. In the last chapter, students are exposed to the basic of market activities. This chapter will explain in more details why the demand curve slopes downward. For your information, consumer behavior theory is important in the economic activities due to producers are always competing with each other to get the consumer to buy their products. At the end of this chapter, the student should be able to define the concept of consumer behavior. Next, explain the total utility, marginal utility, law of diminishing marginal utility, and utility maximization. Next, define and explain the indifference curve analysis. Next one, the student should be able to define the budget line. The student should be able to determine the effect of changes in income and price on budget line. Next, the student should be able to explain how to achieve consumer equilibrium. And lastly, the student should be able to explain the income and substitution effect in consumer equilibrium. So students, what is consumer behavior actually? Consumer behavior refers to the study of consumer while engaged in the process of consumption. For example, some people like jazz music, others hate it. Economists' argument is if an individual prefers jazz music, how many jazz music CDs will he buy? Let's take a look at diamond water paradox example. As we know that water is very cheap, we can get drinking water as cheap as 70 cents, and meanwhile diamonds are so expensive. The observation that things that have the greatest value in use sometimes have little value in exchange, and things that have little value in use sometimes have the greatest value in exchange. So how can this be explained? So, utility theory provides a solution. Let's move to utility theory. Utility can be defined as satisfaction obtained from consuming a commodity, or it is a measure of the satisfaction, happiness, or benefit that results from the consumption of a good. So basically, students, there are two types of utility approach. The first one is cardinal approach. The cardinal utility theory says that utility is measurable, and by placing a number of alternatives, the index used to measure the utility can be called as utils. The second one is ordinal approach. The ordinal utility theory says that utility is not measurable, but it can be compared. Ordinal approach uses the ranking of alternatives as first, second, third, and so on. Okay, let's move to cardinal utility theory. So what is actually total utility? Total utility is total satisfaction a person receives from consuming a particular quantity of good. Meanwhile, marginal utility is additional satisfaction a person receives from consuming an additional unit of particular good. So what is actually law of diminishing marginal utility? Law of diminishing marginal utility can be defined as the additional benefit which a person derives from a given increase of a stock of a thing diminished, other things being equal, with increase in the stock that he already has. Or we can sum up that law of diminishing marginal utility states that as consumption increase more and more, marginal utility will be less and less. The marginal utility gained by consuming equal successive unit of a good will decline as the amount consumed increase. The total utility of something can be rising as the marginal utility of that something is falling. So the formula to calculate marginal utility is change in total utility divided by the change in the quantity of a good. Let's take a look at this example. total utility increase from consumption of first unit of an apple until the fifth unit of an apple. After the fifth unit of apple, total utility of that person will decrease. However, as for marginal utility, when a person consumes an additional unit of apple, the marginal utility drops from 20 to 0. Let's move to law of diminishing marginal utility. When total utility is increasing, we can see that marginal utility will be positive. As we can see from this graph, the marginal utility will increase from 20 up to 50. And then, when total utility is at its maximum, marginal utility will be 0. However, as the total utility is decreasing, the marginal utility will be negative. Let's move to the law of utility maximization. What is utility maximization actually? Other things being equal, a consumer gets maximum satisfaction when he allocates his limited income to the purchase of different goods, where the marginal utility derived from the last unit of money spent on each item of expenditure tends to be equal. Other name of utility maximization is, we can call it as consumer equilibrium. Let's move to the condition for equilibrium. Actually, there are two conditions. The first one is condition 1 and the second one is condition 2. So let's take a look at condition 1. So every ringgit spent on every commodity must yield the same marginal utility. So from this equation, we can see that MU of X per price of X must be equal to MU of Y per price of Y. So as for the condition 2, total expenditure of all goods must be equal to the total budget allocated to maximize utility. So let's take a look at this example. Example, Erwin has an income of 37 ringgit and the price of goods for P, Q and R are 5 ringgit, 1 ringgit and 4 ringgit respectively. So as for condition 1, that I explained earlier, every ringgit spent on every commodity must yield the same marginal utility. It means that as a rational consumer, Erwin will spend his income by choosing the combination of goods where the marginal utility per ringgit for 3 goods is the same. So, in order to fulfill the condition 1, 2 combination of goods are obtained. As for the combination 1, 2 quantities for product P, 4 quantities for product Q, and 1 product R. And for combination 2, 4 product P, 5 product Q, and 3 product R. As for the condition 2 that I explained earlier in the last slide, total expenditure of all goods must be equal to the total budget allocated to maximize utility. So, as for the condition 1, we plug in the figure and it will get the result 18. Meanwhile, for the combination 2, as we plug in the figure, the amount will be 37 ringgit and it will be the same as the Erwin's income. So 4 units of product P, 5 units of product Q, and 3 units of product R will be purchased by Erwin. So right now we will move to ordinal utility theory. So actually, what the consumer wants? Basically, there are 3 assumptions of preference. The first one is preference must be complete and can be ranked, which means that preferences are complete in which the consumer can rank. For example, we take a look at KFC chicken nugget and McD chicken nugget. The consumer prefers McD nugget to KFC nugget, or he is indifferent between the 2 nuggets. So this preference ranking reflects the relative desirability of the options and ignore the cost. The second one, the assumption for preference is it must be transitive. For example, if I like Pepsi better than Coke, Coke better than 7-Up, then logically I like Pepsi than 7-Up. So in a sense that this condition simply means that people have rational or consistent for their preference. And lastly, the assumption for preference is the consumer prefer more to less. For example, given a choice between one vacation in Phuket and 2 vacations in Phuket, a consumer will prefer the latter as the choices are identical. It is usually expressed as more is preferred than less. Okay, let's take a look at this figure. What is actually indifference curve? Actually, indifference curve representing all combination of market baskets that provide a consumer with the same level of satisfaction. The indifference U in this graph that passes through market basket in A shows all baskets that give the consumer the same level of satisfaction as does market basket A. These include basket B and D. So in this graph, our consumer prefers basket E, which lies above line U to A, but our consumer prefers basket E, which lies above line U to A, but prefers A to H or G, which lie below line U. Okay, let's move to indifference map. Okay, what is actually indifference map? Indifference map is a graph containing a set of indifference curves showing the market basket among which a consumer is indifferent. An indifference map is a set of indifference curves that describe a person's preference. Any market basket on indifference curve U, such as basket A, is preferred to any basket on curve U2. For example, basket B, as we can see in the between of D and A, which in turn is preferred to any basket U1, such as D. For your information, indifference curve cannot be intersect. If indifference curve at the line U1 and U2 intersect, one of the assumptions of consumer theory is violated. According to this diagram, the consumer should be indifferent among market basket A, B, and D. Yet, B should be preferred to D because B has more balls of goods. Okay. Now, we move to marginal rate of substitution, or we can call it as MRS. It can be defined as maximum amount of a good that consumer is willing to give up in order to obtain one additional unit of another good. The magnitude of the slope of an indifference curve measures the consumer marginal rate of substitution between two goods. In this figure, the MRS between clothing C and food F falls from between A and B to 4 units, which is between B and D, to 2 units between D and E, to 1 units between E and G. Convexity. The decline in the MRS reflects the diminishing marginal. The decline in the MRS reflects a diminishing marginal rate substitution, as when the MRS diminish along an indifference curve, the curve is convex. Okay students, now we move to budget line. What is budget line? Budget line represents various combinations of two goods which can be purchased with a given amount of money at the given price of each unit. So this is a graph of budget line. It is downward sloping. So let's move to changes in budget line. The first one is change in consumer income. An increase in consumer income will lead to shift of the budget line to the right, A1, B1. An increase in consumers' income will lead to a shift to the budget line to the right, which is A1, B1. Meanwhile, a decrease in consumer income will shift the budget line to the left, as represented by A2, B2. Second one, changes in budget line will be affected by changes in price of goods X. As we can see from the graph, price of goods X increased from 1 ringgit to 2 ringgit and the price of good Y constant. Second one, price of good X decreased from 1 ringgit to 50 cents and price of good Y is held constant. Thirdly, the changes in budget line can be affected by changes in price of good Y. As we can see from the graph, price of good Y increased from 50 cents to 1 ringgit and price of good X is held constant. And meanwhile, as from the second graph, price of good Y decreased from 50 cents to 40 cents and price of good X constant. So let's take a look at the consumer equilibrium. So consumer equilibrium will be happen when he or she is consuming the best possible combination of two goods with a given amount of income. As we can see from this graph, consumer equilibrium is reached when the indifference curve tangent with the budget line, which represented best combination of two goods with limited income at point C. At point B and point E, the consumer will have a lesser satisfaction, and at point B and point E, the consumer will have a lesser satisfaction at line IC3 with the same amount of income. Okay, finally we move to the last slide, which is income, price and substitution effect. The first one, what is actually income effect? The income effect is defined as the effect on the purchases of the consumer caused by changes in income with price of goods remaining constant. And meanwhile, price effect explains what happened to the consumer equilibrium position when the price of one good change, while the price of another good and other factors are remain constant. And lastly, substitution effect can be defined as what happens to the consumer equilibrium position when price of both goods changes, price of one rises and price of another. Okay. And the last one is substitution effect. Substitution effect explains what happens to the consumer equilibrium position when price of both goods changes, price of one rises and price of another falls while other factors remain constant. So students, we have come to an end. So thank you for watching, and in the next chapter we will learn the elasticity. Thank you.